All right, 132, folks. Let's pick up the rest of Chapter 19 in Unit 3. I was talking about what was happening with the Spanish-American War as a result. We end up recruiting the Filipinos, the insurrectos, to help us fight Spain. And then once we defeat Spain, the problem that we have is we don't fulfill what our promises were. And so we end up with this policy of benevolent assimilation. We decided to go ahead and to bring the Philippines into the American idea of things, and that's not what they want. They want to be free. They want to be independent, and so we end up going from freeing them from the Spanish to the Philippine-American War. We end up actually being worse for the Filipinos than the Spanish War. We do terrible things. Okay, we do terrible things. It's an awful war. And what will eventually end up happening is we're going to subjugate the population. Because we're going to subjugate the population, they're not happy. We're not happy. We have the birth of the American Anti-Imperialist League. That's here in the United States. But what we do end up with is something called the Philippine Government Act. And the Philippine Government Act is kind of important because we're going to get a couple other things like the Jones Act and the Forger Act that are going to come through this. The Philippine Government Act allows us and the Philippines to cooperate relatively to craft a new government with some oversight from us, and eventually, and that's eventually, folks, eventually, because we're still back in the beginning of 1900 at this particular point. Philippines is not going to get independent government into much later in the 20th century. What this does is set the guidelines for freeing them along with the Jones Act. And this is important because this is not the only place. We're also going to end up with problems. Even though we have the act, the policy that says, hey, we're not going to go ahead and keep Cuba, we have some problems. And this is where something else comes in, because we start to look at that bit of the Jones Act. We start to look at the Foraker Act. We start to look at something called the Platt Amendment. Dr. Walter Reed is going to come into this, and he's kind of important because what he's going to do is he's going to determine that yellow fever is transmitted by mosquitoes. And the transmission of yellow fever is a huge problem we're having because we're dealing with Cuba, we're dealing with all these other groups, and because we are shipping in and out, because this is all about trade, folks, this disease is being transmitted to the U.S. What he's going to do is determine that if we get rid of standing water, if we clean up facilities, if we clean up certain things, we can stamp out yellow fever. It will be more fit. And what we're going to do is work to modernize, normalize Cuba in such a way that it brings it up to acceptable standards. And then what we're going to do is create the possibility of them going ahead and ruling themselves. This is important because what's going to happen is this Platt Amendment is going to allow Cuba to create its own government. We're going to help, put those in parentheses, help them to create their own constitution. And this own constitution, strangely enough, looks an awful lot like our constitution. What the Platt Amendment does here is it's a little proviso. It gives us the right. Number one, we get the ability to rent land for a coaling station, because the ships run off of coal, folks, for a coaling station, which is a refueling station in Cuba, and that we're going to pay rent on this land. It also gives us the right to come back into Cuba at any time if we feel that they have made a deal, they have made a treaty that is going to interfere with their independent rule. If it puts it at risk, then since they're only 80 miles off of our border, it gives us the right to come in and re-normalize relations with them. It gives us, it's backdoor access, folks, to say, if we don't like what you're doing, we're going to go ahead and come back and fix it. This is problematic because this is going to get us into trouble a few more times along the way. And by the way, we still have that coaling station. If you're thinking, oh yeah, dude, that is Guantanamo Bay. You're right, it is Guantanamo Bay. Interestingly enough, we still pay rent on that property because it's only rented. It's leased to us, folks. We don't own it. But Cuba has not actually cashed a check since its current ruler took over, okay? It's kind of interesting. Here's where we go from here. We end up getting out of Cuba, but that's not enough for us. There's some things going on. And what's going to happen is this. Early on in our presidential succession, we have Monroe. And James Monroe is going to set what's called the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine turns to Europe and says, Europe, we realize you're imperialist. We realize you're spreading out. But we also want you to realize that South and Central America are our backyard, and we don't want you here in our backyard. So it's what I call the old NIMBY complex, not in my backyard. We're going to say, listen, you can imperialize, you can expand, you can colonize, but no more here. No more here. The problem is when he makes an announcement, we don't have the military might to back it up. Not at all. And so there are going to be constant inversions. There are going to be constant issues in South and Central America. In one case, France is going to say, hey, they owe us money in this country here, so we're going to go ahead and take over their port and force them to collect customs and fees and therefore pay us back. Well, here's what's going to happen. When Teddy Roosevelt comes in, he's picked up a page or two. He's going to look and say, hey, I read... who was it? Alfred T. Mahan. Captain Alfred T. Mahan is going to be an admiral. The influence of sea power on history. He's going to have them build a better Navy. He's going to take this better Navy and sail it around. And while he's sailing it around, he is going to send it over to Japan to help with our open door policy. He's going to send it over towards China to help with our open door policy. But also what he's going to do is his policy is simple here. He's going to talk about speaking softly and carry a big stick. He's going to talk about the presidency being his bully pulpit. Not to bully people, but bully as in, I really like this kind of thing. I'm really excited about this kind of thing. He's really bully on it. Very much a English expression. But what he's going to do is he's going to use the presidency as his pulpit to go ahead and advance his agenda. Part of his agenda is he notices these constant interventions in Central and South America. And so what he's going to do is his big stick diplomacy is all about, listen, I'm going to announce the Roosevelt corollary. The Roosevelt corollary says, listen, if there's any military or other enforcement action that needs to be taken in a policing action in Central or South America, we'll do that. Okay? We'll do that. And then what he's also going to do is he's going to implement some other policies with his new Navy. He's going to implement some other policies. One of his most famous ones is the Panama Canal. We have a French company that is trying to build a canal through the Isthmus of Panama, and they can't manage to do it. But what is going to happen is this. They're going to offer to sell their rights for building the canal to the U.S., but Panama isn't Panama yet. Panama is part of Gran Colombia. And Gran Colombia says, we don't want the U.S. here because your open door policy sucks. Every time that we open the door, anybody else opens the door, you walk in and take over. We don't want you. What he's going to do is craft some contacts in the area of Panama, craft some contacts and people in power in Panama, and then he's going to take a ship and park it right there in the Caribbean, right there in the Gulf of Mexico, between Colombia and actual Panama, and he's going to do it there for observation purposes. Once he parks that battleship there, there's going to be an uprising, a revolution in Panama. They're going to declare themselves free from Gran Colombia. They're going to declare themselves an independent state, and then they're going to appeal to the U.S. for recognition. And Teddy Roosevelt's going to say, I got you here. He's going to recognize their independent status. Colombia can't do much about it because they can't cross that battleship to get there to enforce their will. And so what's going to happen is, as recompense for recognition of the new Panama, they're going to go ahead and issue that U.S. company rights to go ahead and create the Panama Canal. There's a lot more happening. I love Teddy Roosevelt. He does some interesting things and has an interesting way of going about it. But I'm going to let you go ahead and read the rest, and make sure you start reading about our interactions with Japan as well.